In this lesson, we develop a toy demo application to show off some of the power of Rails. The purpose is to get a high-level overview of Ruby on Rails programming and web development in general by rapidly generating an application using scaffold generators, which create a large amount of functionality automatically. The resulting toy app allows us to interact with it through its URLs, giving us insight into the structure of the Rails application, including a first example of the REST architecture favored by Rails. As with the forthcoming sample application, the toy app consists of users and their associated microposts, thus constituting a minimalist Twitter-style application.
The majority of these videos were actually made with Rails 4, which might make you think they're out of date, but in fact the opposite is true. They're an indication of just how stable the core of Rails is, and how well Rails has codified many of the best practices for making web applications. This stability means that the things you learn here won't quickly go out of date, which is a real rarity in the software development world. On occasion, I'll add short text inserts indicating that something in the tutorial has changed since the screencasts were first made. Making note of these changes, and updating future code examples accordingly, makes for a good exercise in technical sophistication. When in doubt, you should refer to the text, whose code should always be up to date. If you believe you found some difference that deserves to be called out with a text note, please send me an email at michael@learnenough.com. Finally, the rest of the tutorial uses a slightly different Cloud IDE configuration than the one we've been using so far. In particular, it's stretched all the way to fill the screen, and also uses a dark background, which used to be the Cloud 9 default, and which you can configure yourself like this. Many developers, including me, like to use a dark background when coding, but it doesn't make much of a difference, and you should use whichever configuration you prefer. And now, without further ado, it's time to proceed with the rest of the Ruby on Rails tutorial screencasts. Welcome to the Ruby on Rails tutorial screencast, Lesson 2, a toy app. In this lesson, we'll develop a toy demo application to show off some of the power of Rails. The purpose is to get a high-level overview of Ruby on Rails programming and web development in general, without getting too bogged down in the details. Even though the app is only a toy, by the end of the lesson we will have deployed a live database-backed web application to a production environment. As in Lesson 1, we'll get started by generating a new application. Remember, that's Rails new and then the name of the app, in this case toy app. And I really do recommend using the exact version. You're welcome to use the version that's in the book, but this is the one that I used in the first lesson, so I'm going to stick with it. But as we'll see, in fact, it's already changed. They pushed out a new version of Rails 4.2 beta, it's beta 2, the same day that I cut the first screencast, which is why it's important to use the version at the URL I'm about to show you, instead of the one you see in the screencast. So let's go here. So we want to go to toy app gem file .railstutorial.org, and this will forward to GitHub. And so you should use this version, whatever you see here. Not what you see on the screen, what you see at this URL. And so this goes in the gem file. This is just what we did in the previous lesson, same idea. So we're going to define the gems, and then we need to cd into the directory, and bundle install, and we want to bundle install without production. That just skips these gems here that we don't need locally. It would actually work fine, I think, if you did that, but this is a little cleaner. Right, so this is the kind of thing that absolutely will happen. It says, oh, this isn't what I expected. It didn't work. But don't panic. Just read what it says. It says at the bottom, running bundle update will rebuild your snapshot from scratch. So maybe that'll work. This is what happens when you change a Rails version in the gem file. It's different. It's 4.2.0.beta 2, and we generated this with beta 1. Now we're going to follow the same basic steps that we did in the last lesson, just as a way to practice and as a way to get all this overhead done right at the beginning. So what we're going to do is put this application under version control. We're going to push it up to Bitbucket, and we're going to deploy this early version to Heroku. I'll just make a hello world version for now. So we first initialize the repository, add all of the files, commit it. Then we need to make a new repository. So let's go here, go to Bitbucket, and I want to create it, and just follow the instructions. I have an existing project. We can skip this first line because we're already in the right directory. Just copy this here. And then push up all of the branches. There's only one, it's just the master branch. And we can skip the tags here. It's the last line. We don't have any tags. Right, so I've done that push, and now I can probably refresh it and see it. Yep, there it works. Source, app, controllers, application controller, etc. So that's good. And let's go here and let's deploy it. Oh, actually, no. Let's make it hello. Let's do the hello world. So we make an action and then update the routes and config routes down here. Oops, it's on the right line already. Application controller, hello action, and let's run the server. Oops, we need to cd to the directory. The binding IP and the port will tell Cloud9 the right place to run things. All right, so it's working there, hello world, and I'm going to make a commit here. And that's so that oh man, the exclamation point doesn't work. This is a bash. Bash is what we're running here. It's a terminal. It's a shell, and the exclamation point refers to some previous event. So this is the kind of little thing that happens. But you can escape it out. You can get rid of it, or you can escape it out with a backslash. There it goes. And now I want to create a new Heroku app. It's a really good idea to deploy early and often. You don't want to deploy at the end of the day and then realize you have all kinds of horrible integration headaches. Let's go here. Oh no, I'm going to git push. Git push Heroku master, and I'm going to copy this here. So this won't be anything other than the default right there. Let's take a look at it. There we go, hello world. All right, everything's working, and now we're ready to actually start making this toy app. The main sample application used in the Rails tutorial, which we'll start developing in the next lesson, is kind of a minimalist clone of Twitter. But in fact, most of the application is very generic. It just involves things like a registration form, login, logout, all of the kinds of things that basically any website's going to need. So we'll start in this lesson with just a preview, like a prototype of that idea. We'll start with this notion of users who will eventually be able to sign up for the website and log in and so forth. And we'll also introduce this idea of short posts or micro posts, just based on the idea that Twitter is a micro blog. And in this context, it's a good idea to start planning out what our data model is going to look like. So let's take a look at a diagram. Here's a diagram of users. This is written in such a way that it can be a table in a database. So the convention that Rails uses is that database tables are plural, and we think of this as a singular model, a user model. And in this case, it has three different fields. It's got an ID attribute, name, and email. The ID is an integer, the name and email are each strings. So one of our tasks is going to be to translate this little diagram into a code and actually have our application be able to manipulate these users. Meanwhile, these short posts or micro posts will look like this. In this case, there's again a unique ID. This is an integer that identifies the micropost. And then there will be content, which actually could be a string because it's going to be just a small amount of content. That would actually fit inside a string, but we want to think of this as a text field, and in fact, the entry form, when you actually look at the web page, is for a text field. And this also gives us some flexibility going forward if we decide we want to relax the length restriction. And then there's a user ID field that is an integer. It identifies the user who made the micropost. We're going to get started with this toy application by using Rails generate. So Rails comes with this command line interface, the Rails command, and one of the things it can do is generate all kinds of different things, including the sort of things that you see here, controllers, models, and so on. So it can generate lots of things, and we will be using the generate command throughout this tutorial, but what we're about to do now we will only do in this lesson. We're going to generate what's called a scaffold. What this does is it generates a bunch of code, including a user interface for the object we're about to create. And generally speaking, I don't think it's a good idea for people to be generating scaffolds, but this is sort of an instant gratification way of getting an overview, even though this isn't what we're going to do in real life. So once you've typed out Rails generate scaffold, then you give it the name of the model, the name of the data model, which in this case is user, the singular version of users. And then we can give it the attributes. Now, if you look here, there's the ID, name, and email. Now, it turns out that Rails will automatically create this ID field for us. We don't need to do that. But what we can do is, at the command line, tell Rails that there's a name, that's a string, and an email address that's also a string. That command generated a file called a migration. It's under db migrate. You can take a look at it. Don't worry about what this actually says. This isn't important at this point. We'll be talking a lot more about this later on. But the idea is that this lets us manipulate the database. We get to change the data model that the database represents. So what I'm going to do here is run the migration from that file. For safety, it's a good idea to type bundle exec. This makes sure to execute the command that I'm about to type using the exact gems specified by the gem file. But in a lot of contexts, including on the Cloud IDE, it's often possible to skip this step. But if it doesn't work, you should definitely try bundle exec. So this is the rake command. It's just a very general tool for building software and making things happen in specifically with respect to Ruby applications, although it can be used in other contexts as well. And then we type db:/migrate. So this will update our database with the data model. Let's take a look at what that did for us. Go here to our application. Now this is the same hello world that's just at slash, but that scaffold gave us some other URLs. So for example, let's go to /users. So you can see that the scaffold command generated a basic user interface. So we can, for example, click on new user. can type in name. mhartle@example.com, create the user. So that created a new user, and you can see there's a little message, user was successfully created. Go back and see that now our listing of users has the example that I just put in. So this is actually amazing if you think about it. This actually worked. This somehow stored the data that I just entered into the form, and now it's displaying it back onto this page. Let's add another user. And we can also edit a user. Update a user. Go back to the index, and we can also destroy a user. Now, the way we're interacting with this application is through the URLs. So this is an architecture that's known as REST. We'll be talking a lot more about this later in the tutorial. It stands for Representational State Transfer. And it's a standard way of organizing applications that's very powerful and quite general. Applies to a lot of different cases. So let's just go back through this and see what the URLs look like. Here it's /users. Here it's /users/1. This 1 is the ID. Remember, we saw this here. That's the ID of the user. Edit is /users/1/edit. And the other URLs that happen when you click destroy or when you click create user or update user are happening under the hood in the sense that we don't actually see them exposed, but they're being handled internally by Rails. You might recall from the last lesson that I mentioned the MVC architecture, or Model View Controller, and at this point I want to go over that in a little more detail. Here's a diagram of MVC. Let's just follow the numbers and go through and get a sense of what's happening in this application. So first of all, we would go to /users, that's step 1, and that hits the Rails router. So let's go over here and take a look at that. It's in config routes. And the router routes /users to the index action in the user's controller. You might wonder where that is in this file, and the answer is it's happening here. There's a magical line that creates a bunch of different routes for us, and that essentially maps something like /users to the index action in the user's controller. So let's take a look at the user's controller. It's an app controllers user's controller. Now, I want you not to pay too much attention to the things in this file. It's quite complicated. In fact, there are things in this file that I don't really understand. But here's the index action. And what this is doing is this is creating what's called an instance variable at users, and that's equal to user.all. So let's look back at our diagram. So step 2 is mapping to the index action in the user's controller. Step 3 is to talk to the user model. That's what this is doing. Capital user here is the user model. You might be able to guess where that is. It's in app models, user.rb. You can see the file is practically empty. This little character here in Ruby indicates inheritance. So there is a class that defines a bunch of different functionality called active record base, and user automatically has all of that functionality by virtue of inheritance. Again, we'll be talking about this in more depth later in the tutorial if this material is new to you. So step 3 is to make a call to the user model, and then the user model actually talks to the database. That's the part of MVC that's responsible for interacting with the database that actually stores the data, that persists it from one request to the next, and so on. So step 4. Step 5 is to pass that result back to the controller. So you can see here, that's this. That's where user.all is returning all of the users and putting it in this variable. And that's at users here, and that's number 6. And that then goes to the view, which is index.html.erb. ERB stands for embedded Ruby, by the way. Again, we'll be talking a lot more about this later. So it's an app views users and index.html.erb. And what this file does is that it goes through each of the users, and for each of the users it displays the name, email address, and then some links to show, edit, destroy. So that is what creates this page. This page is being created by this view here. And then it passes the HTML back to the controller, which passes it back to the browser. Now, I'm actually not sure. Sometimes it's possible, it depends on the details, that this HTML might be going right from the view back to the browser, but conceptually I like to think of the controller as just sitting in the middle and controlling everything. That's why it's called the controller. In any case, this is the end result is that step 8 is the HTML gets passed back to the browser, and then it gets rendered like this. It's conventional in web applications for slash, which is just this, to be some sort of index page. So as a final step in discussing this user scaffold, I'd like to change this page from hello world to the user's index. See if you can figure out how to do this. Of course, I'm about to show you, but this is a good practice. So here are the routes. Well, first of all, let's get rid of this hello action that we don't need anymore. Right, in the routes here, the root route is being routed to the name of the controller, which now we want to be, we'll take a look over here, it's plural. This is a convention in Rails. It's the user's controller, and we want it to be the index action. Okay. It's right here. So let's save that and see if it worked. Look at that. So now it's kind of funny that I keep calling it slash, but if you put the slash on it, it disappears. But this is called slash. This is the root route. And now it's, in fact, connected to the user's index. Before leaving this user model and moving on to the micropost data model, I'd like to make a few comments just evaluating this thing we've made. I should mention in this context that when you talk about not just a data model, but also this set of URLs, that this kind of object in Rails is called a resource. So this is the user's resource. It's a set of URLs and the database backend. If you think about it, this is really amazing what we're doing here. We're actually interacting with our application through these URLs and persisting data, the names of the users, email, and so on. And somewhere in the system there's a database, which we'll actually be taking a look at later in this tutorial. But for now, I'd like to mention some of the weaknesses of this resource. One of the problems we have is that there are no data validations. So for example, I can just create a new user with a blank name and email address. That's not the kind of thing that you would ordinarily allow on an application that has users signing up. There's no sense of authentication, for example. There's no way to have protected pages. In other words, there's no way to have someone be able to log in. Users can't log into this site. It's just everything is exposed to everyone. There are no tests of anything. There are no automated tests of our application. And that's actually not quite true. There are tests generated by the Rails generate command. But there are no tests that do anything very useful. In particular, there are no tests of validations or authentication or anything like that. There's no layout, there's no styling, there's nothing that looks anything like a real application. This is clearly just a stub. And finally, we have no real understanding. Like this application code here that was generated is just overwhelming. If you're new to Rails, there's just so much going on here. So throughout the rest of this tutorial, we're going to build up these ideas piece by piece, so that by the end of this tutorial, you'll understand basically everything in this file. The thing that we won't cover is, and that I don't really understand all that well, is this line. We won't be talking about these JSON renderings. But everything else we'll be covering in this tutorial. We'll create microposts using the same basic command, Rails generate scaffold. In this case, it's going to be a micropost resource. For some reason, scaffolds use the singular. I'm not sure why. When you generate controllers, it's the plural, models are the singular. Eventually, these will become second nature to you. So we have a content. Remember, let's take a look at our model here. The content is a text field, and then there's a user ID that's an integer. There's actually a second way to do this association between microposts and users, which we'll talk about later in the tutorial. That'll be lesson 11. As with users, that created a migration for us. We can take a look here. Just close these down. Actually, I think there's a way to close them all down. Collapse all folders. That's cool. So let's go to, it's a db migrate. And here's the micropost table. And as before, we use rake db migrate. Oops, forgot the rake. It's because I had to type bundle exec. I don't usually do that, but I think it's a good idea because that really makes it the least error prone. Let's go back to our diagram of MVC. Remember, the first step is that there's a Rails router that tells the system where to map this URL. And so with users, we had /users, and that got routed to the index of the users controller. So you can probably guess by parallel structure what it looks like in the case of the micropost. So it's an app controller. Well, so actually first let's look at the config. So it's in config routes. This is the router. You can see that the generate command, this Rails generate scaffold, put in this line, resources microposts. So that's what creates this mapping. And then in the controllers, micropost controller, very similar to the users controller. In fact, it's identical except for the name, micropost versus users. So here's the index, micropost.all, and so on. I keep emphasizing that we're just getting a taste of this. This should be confusing at this point. There's so much material being thrown at you at once. If you've not done this before, it's likely that there's just too much to take in. This is just to get a taste. We're going to be covering everything here throughout the rest of the tutorial. So in analogy with this idea of /users, going to index, let's take a look at our application. Actually, let's close this down and go to /microposts. And here's the micropost model, or the URL we're interacting with. You can look at the URLs, /microposts, new microposts is /micropost/new. Make first micropost, and we can put in a user and say that's user 1, create the micropost, go back to the index page. Yep, why isn't that working? Ah, that took longer than I expected. And we have the same set of URLs. We can edit it, maybe tone it down a little bit here. But you can see that it's basically the same pattern that we had with the user's resource. As implied by the name micropost, though, there's definitely some extra structure. So let's get a first taste of validations by actually putting the micro in micropost. So let's go over here, and this happens in the model. This is the part of the system that talks to the database and that actually models the data. So in this case, part of our data model is that we want the content to be short. So let's just use the basic Twitter convention of having 140 characters. It's actually a little more complicated than that, but for our purposes, that'll be fine. So the way to do this in Rails is to type validates and then the name of the field we want to validate, which in this case is content. This is what's called a symbol. We'll be talking more about that in lesson 4 especially. And then we're going to give it a length. And the length parameter is going to have a maximum of 140 characters. Save that. Now let's go back to our application. Say, let's try to create a micropost with too much text. My favorite way to get a long amount of text is to go to my text editor, which in this case is Sublime Text. It has a tab trigger for lorem ipsum. This is a fragment from Cicero. It's actually dolorem ipsum, dolor sit but this is has a long and glorious history in this kind of context. Oops. So let's copy that and then paste it in. And if we create it, it should complain. And there it is. Content is too long. Now, this code that generates this error here, this error message, is part of the scaffolding. In the main part of the tutorial, when we make the industrial strength sample app, we'll actually be writing these error messages ourselves. Or more specifically, we'll be writing the code to generate these error messages. As a final step in this introduction to data modeling, I want to talk about the idea of associating one model with another. And in this case, users, these slash users, actually it's just a slash, either will work. Users in general will have potentially many microposts. So there's an association between users and microposts. Let's look at a diagram of that. This is a diagram of the kinds of rows that you might see in a database. Here's the micropost table with a row for each micropost and a users table with a row for each user. So the user ID here links into the user underscore ID field of the micropost table. And so you can see here that the first two microposts both belong to the first user, and the second micropost belongs to the second user. And so this first user has many microposts. There are two. The second user also has many microposts. It just happens that there's only one, but there could be multiple ones. The way to express that relationship in Rails is to use has many and belongs to. So let's open up our user model. That was the go to anything here, go to anything, either Command E or Command P, and then you can change it up if you're on Windows. It's a really useful way of finding a file if you know the name of the thing you're looking for, instead of having to navigate in this navigator here. What we want to say here is that a user has many microposts, and a micropost belongs to a user. That's what's going to set up that association. Now later on we'll be actually expressing that relationship through a web interface, but I don't want to build that right now. It's a little bit too complicated this early in the tutorial. So I want to show you how this works using a really powerful tool called the Rails console. Let's take a look at that. The Rails console essentially gives us a command line environment for interacting with our Rails app. So for example, I can pull the first user out of the database like this. Just give it a name, and this is the user model, user.first. We'll pull out the first user. One of the things that the console shows you is this raw SQL. This is the structured query language understood by databases, or at least the kinds of databases we'll be using. But it's not important at this stage to worry about what this command is doing. It's just a useful thing to be able to map this Ruby to the SQL, especially in case you're familiar with SQL already. We can access the different attributes of this user like this, just using the dot command, first user dot name, Michael Hartle, email, and so on. But we can also use this. We can say microposts because of this line here, has many microposts, and because of the association between the ID of the user and the user ID column here in the microposts. And there it is. First micropost here is associated with the user. Go back here and make a new micropost. Let's go here. Also associated with user 1, and go over here and Let's just run it again. And so this is actually a subtlety. You can see that it didn't show up, and that's because this user here is the one that is just in memory in our application or in this console. So what we could do is we could redo this. We could do first user equals user.first. That will work. But there's a fancier way to do it, which is to reload it. You can do this. You can actually chain these methods together, which means just having one after the other. Reload the user, and there's the second post. Just to recapitulate, start from scratch, pull the user out of the database, and there it is. Finally, we can access this micropost like this. Just say this micropost is the first user.micropost.first. Just pull that out. And then we can ask the micropost, what's your content? And because of this line that belongs to user, we can also ask the micropost who its user is. And there we go. So that's how associations work at a very high level. And of course, this will get discussed in a lot more depth later on in the tutorial. It's Control D to get out of the console. You can also type exit. We're going to deploy the application to production, but before moving on to that step, I'd like to discuss some of the inheritance hierarchies that we're using in this lesson. This discussion is mainly for those who have a background in object-oriented programming, but it's not going to do you any harm to get a quick overview if you haven't seen this before. So let's take a look at this. This is the inheritance hierarchy for the models. So we have active record base. This is the base class that has a bunch of things like the methods we just saw, like all, like user.all or user.first. That all happens inside of active record base. And both the user and micropost models inherit from active record base, so they automatically get all those methods. Take a look at the models. So that's this line here. I mentioned it briefly before. This syntax here is inheritance in Ruby. The inheritance hierarchy for controllers is a little bit more complicated, but just slightly. There's an action controller base, an analogy with active record base. And then there's another controller that sits between the controllers we generated, called application controller. It's this. And then the user's controller and the micropost controller each inherit from the application controller. See here, same syntax. The reason for the second tier here, for this extra layer, is because it's very convenient to be able to put things in the application controller that apply to all of the controllers in the application. And if it weren't for this layer, we would have to actually edit somehow action controller base. But that's part of the Rails framework itself. It's not exposed to application developers. All right, we're now ready to deploy the application to production. We already deployed the Hello World version, but now I actually want to show that we can have this database-backed web application working in a production environment. Let's see where we are, get status. It's a bunch of files. Just do this here. Let's add them all. See the status now. Now they're all added. Just out of habit, I'm going to push this up to the remote repository. This is Bitbucket. And then I can push it up to Heroku. All right, let's take a look at it. Think about what's going to happen here. Is this going to work? Where was it? Rocky Retreat. Oh, we're sorry, but something went wrong. Uh-oh. Let's see if we can figure it out. This is good practice. Look at the logs. Let's take a look at the log here and see if we can figure out what might be the problem. So let's look at action view template error, PG undefined table, relation users did not exist. So there's a bunch of stuff here, all kinds of detail. But it's a really useful skill to acquire, to be able to look at this log and not be intimidated by it and say, I'm just going to look at it, maybe I can figure it out. So this is a huge hint. This means that the users table in the database doesn't exist, which is true because remember the way that we created that table locally, the way that we actually prepared the database was to run a migration with rake db migrate. So we have not told Heroku about our data model. That means that we need to run the migration to Heroku as well. So let's do that. The way to do that is with the Heroku command, just this, the command line interface, then the word run, so Heroku run, and then the thing we want to do, which in this case is rake db migrate. That looks promising. Let's take a look at the app, refresh it, and there we go. The toy app is running in production. Create user. Go to the microposts. Create a new micropost and give it too much content. The validation's working, and we can even run a console at Heroku. See if you can figure out what it's going to be. We just hit Heroku run rake db migrate. It's Heroku run. It wasn't quite a perfect analogy. It's not Heroku run Rails console. It's Heroku run console. And now we can do this. User.first. There's the user. User.first.microposts. And there it is. So this application has a lot of strengths. This is a real database-backed web application running in a production environment. This has given us a really nice high-level overview of Rails, an introduction to MVC, a first taste of the REST architecture. We've done a little bit of data modeling, and it's really quite remarkable that we've been able to go from zero in the last lesson to having a database-backed web app in production at the end of lesson 2. But of course, this does have a lot of weaknesses. No one would ever mistake this for a real web application. So fixing up those weaknesses is the main task of the rest of the tutorial. So let's get to it.
In this lesson, we begin developing the professional-grade sample application that will serve as our example throughout the rest of this tutorial. Although this sample app will eventually have users, microposts, and a full login and authentication framework, we begin with a seemingly limited topic, the creation of static pages. Along the way, we get our first taste of automated testing, which will help us be more confident that our code is correct. Moreover, having a good test suite allows us to refactor our code with confidence, changing its form without changing its function.